We're in? We're in. All right, great. Let me see here. All right, it's okay to turn in the midterm early, in case you wanted to do that. How are you finding it so far?
Pretty easy.
Okay. Good. Glad to hear that. All right. I'm going to take you mostly around the areas, of the readings around mostly Asante, because one of the things that I found by focusing the class partially on Africa and the larger scheme of things, you can't necessarily explain what happens, why Africans in America, for example, right after slavery, are able to do some of the things they do unless you know what happened with Africa. So why is this not happening? All right. When your machine. So continuing from where we left off, we were doing the Oregon Constitution, just to give you kind of a context. This is just before Civil War, which is about after the Constitution had been voted on. And to quote, this is from the Salem, Oregon Statesman, August 4th, 1857. In arriving at this conclusion, we are not influenced, and basically they're talking about the vote of slavery, whether you're going to be a slave state or a free state. In arriving at this conclusion, we are not influenced by hostility to the institution of African slavery per se. We are of the opinion that in the sugar and cotton growing states, it is a necessary, if not indispensable, system of labor. We believe also that the African, whatever his nominal condition, is destined to be the servant and subordinate of the superior white race. And it is best for both races that that servitude and subordination should be regulated by law. And we believe also that the wisdom of man has not yet devised a system under which the Negro is as well off as he is under that of American slavery. Still, we think that our climate, soil, situation, population, etc., render it to any useful extent an impossible institution for Oregon. So part of the theory about the climate was that since Africans were used to hot tropical climates and it was cold and rainy and wet here, that their natural tendency to be lazy would be enhanced by the rain, which I could see that. In early November 1857, the voters of Oregon approved the proposed state constitution by a decisive margin. At the same time, slavery was excluded 7,727 to 2645, and free Negroes were prohibited from settling in Oregon, 8640 to 1081. The pro-slavery vote, compared to the amount of agitation that had emanated from the pro-slavery camp, made the whole affair seem like a tempest in a teapot. The electorate wanted none of the Negro race. Free Negroes were banned from Oregon by an even greater majority than slavery. So one of the lessons that I was taught and that then passed on to my kids in terms of talking about the ancestors that we were raised to think about, the message was this. Because having experienced the usual treatment of what slavery was, how it was treated in American schools. So if you're like, for example, the only black kid in the class, and I was for a large part of my academic career, whenever they talked about slavery, you could just feel all the eyes just like come to you, right? And so, no matter how horrible it would seem, you'd still basically then be asked to speak for the race, et cetera, et cetera. Well, how do you feel about that? And what are you supposed to say? You're like 10 when this is going on, right? So the message that I gave to my kids that was given to me was that slaves were smart. And slaves were smart because Africans were smart. And part of the example that when he's talking in that chapter, Asante is talking in his chapter of generators of traditional and contemporary Africa, one of the things that I liked about this, not only this section of the book, but the details that he talks about what we call medieval Africa between 1000 in the Common Era and, say, 1500. Basically slaves were smart because Africans are smart and Africans were smarter than we were allowed to think. So, for example, on page 146, Aluma defeated the Tata and the Tuaregs, employing Turkish infantry and musketeers who had worked in Egypt as part of his army. Aluma was able to defeat most of his neighbors with the new weapons brought into his empire. Now, the reason I bring this up is because someone in emailing their reaction paper asked like 3 questions about, okay, what happened? How did we get to this particular case? And I said, there's one way you can think, there's a lot of different ways of answering this particular question. And for example, you could go the Jared Diamond route. So Jared is a historian from UCLA, and he basically, his book's called, Guns, Germs, and Steel. So he said, the Indians got wiped out because of, it wasn't, he kind of, to the degree that I can determine from the book, he basically is kind of race neutral. It's basically saying, look, it was just superior technology, guns, germs, and steel. The Indians didn't have resistance to European diseases, and that wiped them out. Like, not that there were genocidal practices, but that's just a normal component of when things come together. Well, or when different cultures come together. Okay. But Africans had guns too. And so one could ask, because people have asked before, well, if Africans had guns before Europeans, then why couldn't they resist? Well, only certain of them had guns. And there was not necessarily, remember this is a continent, not a country, so you're not necessarily going to get unity, and it's going to be the same problem that you have with Europe. There wasn't a united Europe in the Romans' time. That had to happen much later, in medieval periods. So we have enough information from travelers to say that the trade in cola, ivory, gold, salt, and people fueled a lot of commerce. So he's still talking about this same empire. So I'm just calling your attention to foodstuffs and different commodities. So cola is basically a vegetable-based stimulant. It's a food, and it's traded, and this is one of the bases of Coca-Cola. That's where cola drinks come from, the cola nut in Africa. Another example, Amina of Zaria. Zaria was preeminent as a military leader and must be considered alongside the panoply of African conquerors such as Taharqa, Ramses II, Tutmosis III, Sundiata, and Sinyale Bear. As a female military leader, she is clearly in the company of Amanirenas, and Yanenga. One fought Caesar's armies and stopped them dead in their tracks as they sought to invade Nubia. The other stormed out of the grassy plains of West Africa with thousands of loyal cavalry troops to establish the Mossi dynasty. So when we speak of Amina of Zaria, we must see her in the context of some of the world's greatest fighting women. So to basically answer, as I've said before, in terms of looking at the whole questions that we deal with in America of women in the military, look, you have to be pretty badass to stop Caesar as a woman military commander. So that question had already been long settled in Africa. Gays in the military, what are you tripping about? People want to fight to defend their country. Doesn't matter who they sleep with. Usman Danfodio continued to write treatises against the local rulers, especially the leaders of Gobir. He had two main complaints. First, the political leaders had allowed the traditional African culture to corrupt Islam. Now, the reason I brought this up is because there are, our understanding of what Islam is and where it came from is kind of focused on, I don't know how many of you watch cable, but part of the whole piece about, killing Osama bin Laden and the interest in, Islamic terrorism, et cetera, or Islam being a terroristic religion, and, we can go back and forth about that in terms of the body count, because if we look at the body count just here in America, it's not with Muslims. So one of the pieces in terms of this kind of battle has, so to speak, has been kind of fought in Africa as well. Now, the two main complaints when he's talking about political leaders had allowed the traditional African culture to corrupt Islam. Well, Islam came out of African culture. But the difference being one of the Abrahamic religions that basically was talking about the one God, the God of Abraham, rather than the panoply of African gods and goddesses who were, as we'll see with Yoruba in a few slides hence, it's a different framework. So when we see the ascendancy of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, they all have this meme of supremacy over older forms of religious and spiritual expression. Second, the local leaders did not protect Muslims from enslavement. So one cannot ignore the piece of African involvement in the slave trade, particularly with Muslims being a primary part of that. So the next page talks about, it's basically from Shehu of Borno. Tell us why you are fighting us and enslaving our free people. If you say you have done this to us because of our paganism, then I say that we are innocent of paganism and it is from our compound, and it is far from our compound. If praying and the giving of alms, knowledge of God, fasting in Ramadan, and the building of mosques is paganism, what is Islam? So basically talking about, look, why are you enslaving us and we're fellow Muslims? So this is one of the results that we see here is that a third of the slaves that come to the United States are Muslim, but forced to become Christians because they can't, pray to Mecca 5 times a day under slavery. There is a discussion basically about the fourth and fifth jihads, which if you haven't picked up on it, gives you a little bit more granularity into what a jihad is, and jihad's going against essentially what the Muslims perceive as pagans or other folks that could have lived in peace with them and did not. Now, the great jihad, as Muhammad characterized it, is against your own ego, or as it is said in Arabic, nafs. And there's 5 kinds of nafs. I'm not going to get into how many different types of ego there are, but there's angry ego and arrogant ego and various other types of ego. And so the great jihad is internal to you. It's the struggle that you have internally, because it's nafs that keeps you from submitting to the will of Allah or Islam. So better to conquer yourself, I'd say. Lesser jihads, as Muhammad once referred to as lesser jihads, are wars against people. So these fourth and fifth, the first through fifth jihads are basically the lesser jihads. Better to conquer yourself. Great Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe itself, in Shona, the Shona language, the music that you hear as the intro and outro to the class is Shona music. It's Mbira. The song means each to his own way. And Zimbabwe in Shona means place of stone houses. Now, a lot of these walls were basically, some of them you can't necessarily tell from the scale, but as your book notes, they're 6 feet thick and they're put together without mortar or cement. Basically just stones piled on top of each other. And there are about 300 plus of them, and Great Zimbabwe is the largest, probably most impressive in one point of view. So 300 plus of these stone houses in Zimbabwe, what's now Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. The Great Zimbabwe is the largest and thriving from the 11th to 15th centuries. So it had trade. It was a city that had trade with India and China. The king lived in the great enclosure, pictured here, with his wives, gold, silver, bronze, eating from plates imported from Persia and China. 12,000 people lived in this around 1400, making it one of the largest cities in Africa, and hence a center of trade, and also therefore a target for Europeans, particularly Portuguese, trying to monopolize various commodities, including gold and people. With the Yoruba, and I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time with them, but this is some of the tenets of the Yoruba religion, and I call your attention to it. Granted, I am cherry picking and cherry picking from the readings, but some of the tenets of the Yoruba religion. There is one supreme God. Only 2 days are certain: birth and death. All others can be forecast and changed. You are born with a specific destiny or path in your life. Your spirit lives after death and can reincarnate through blood relatives. Divination is the instrument that will reveal your path. Our ancestors, being present, must be honored, respected, and consulted. You must never harm another human being or the universe because they are you. Sacrifice is necessary to assure spiritual success, so whether that means work or, as in divination, sacrifice of an animal, in the divination rites, then that's what's necessary. All realms of our existence must work together to be balanced. And character is the greatest trait for the human being. Now, how this character is expressed, the word that translates into English as coolness is the ultimate goal of character, and I'll talk more about that later, perhaps not later today, but I can give you a reference. Robert Ferris Thompson, in his book Flash of the Spirit, so he's like an art historian talking about the influence of Yoruba culture on contemporary Africa as well as contemporary art. There was a Michael Ventura who used to write for the, I believe it was LA Weekly or LA Free Press or whatever, wrote a long piece called Hear That Long Snake Moan. It's basically the African roots of rock and roll. And he's basically talking about the African roots of rock and roll being heavily influenced by Yoruba culture. So when you talk about the things that were denied Africans practicing their religion in slavery being imported to America, how many of you have witnessed black gospel, particularly funerals? And the music that's there, not just the hymns, but kind of like, the, I don't know how to describe it in musical terms, but it's basically singing without accompaniment. And so there's specific melodies and very slow dirge-like rhythm, which some of the melodies sound a lot like Amazing Grace, which kind of lends credibility to the idea that Amazing Grace, the melody from it, was an African song that Newton appropriated. But when Ferris Thompson is talking about the concept of coolness, there's a phrase in Yoruba, Okan itutu, and it means his heart is cool. That doesn't mean his heart is cold. It means that he's, as we would say in English, chill. No matter what's going on, he remains calm, or a person remains calm, because they are infused with a primal force that in Yoruba is referred to as Ashe, which is the power to make things happen. And the more infused you are with Ashe, the cooler you are. So cool art is not without passion, it's full of passion, full of feeling. So you could talk about, when Miles Davis talked about the birth of the cool, he's basically carrying on an African tradition. So, cool, chill out, don't worry. So one must engage the forces of nature, the Orishas, the Loa, the saints. So for example, in the Western forms of the African imported forms of the Yoruba religion, Makumba, Santeria, Candomblé, Vodun, Mial. Ifa is the deity within this framework who was with Olodumare when the universe was formed. And Eshu, Elegba, Elegiwa, the owner of roads and opportunity, the Loa of the crossroads, who actually wears the crossroads as a hat. So as an example, there's a story. So Eshu Elegbara, Elegba, Legba, Elegiwa, he's a shapeshifter, so he can be male or female, and Elegiwa is his feminine aspect. One day he was walking through a village, and he is characterized by wearing a feather on his hat. And this particular hat, one side was black and one side was red. And it was very noticeable. And so as he left in his wake, he sparked an argument. And the argument was, did you see that person with a red hat? No, it was a black hat. And so they're both arguing. And basically what he's teaching, because sometimes as being the Lord of the Crossroads, he's teaching that you have to see both sides of a question to arrive at a complete answer, a complete understanding. So this crossroads basically looks a lot like this, where these quadrants are the inner world of a person, and these are what you can see visibly. So what a person is not just what you can see visibly, they're also having an inner world. So you have to understand their inner motivations to explain their outer actions. That means you have to talk with them or use divination to understand where they're coming from. So these are not, the crossroads are not just turning points, they're also opportunities, points of view. So there's a phrase at the end of that particular chapter: let us not engage the world hurriedly. Let us not grasp at the rope of wealth impatiently. Now, this piece, this rope of wealth, when Yeshua talks about that line about it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into heaven, the words that he's using in Aramaic, like to rhyme camel with gamel, camel is the animal, gamel is rope, and it's symbolic of wealth. And the only way that you can pass a rope through the eye of a needle is to unravel it, strand by strand, and send it through the needle. Thus, in terms of accumulating wealth, the way that you enter heaven is by letting go of your wealth, letting go of attachment to it, passing it through the eye of the needle. So this reference here, let us not grasp at the rope of wealth impatiently, being patient. That which should be treated with mature judgment. Let us not deal with this in a state of anger. That which should be treated with mature judgment, let us not deal with in a state of anger. When we arrive at a cool place, let us rest fully. Let us give continual attention to the future, and let us give deep consideration to the consequence of things, because of our own eventual passing. Let's move this up. Okay, what happened here? Okay. All right. Another level of the hero is the teller of the tale, as I was talking about the other day. The difference between just like one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. One person's legend is another person's religion. So the hero is the teller of the tale.